This is the story of a WebGL engine, where sprites were drawn onto a screen. Then a friend, a frame buffer, came to help. He said, "Render unto me first, before you render to the screen." And the sprites did, with different blend modes that led to the creation of a rudimentary lighting effects. And so our story continues.
Welcome back, folks, to part 4 of this WebGL tutorial. So this is where we were last time. We were rendering a couple of sprites, animating them and rendering different sprites on a different layer on top of each other with different blend modes. So whenever we last wrote this, it was a bit of a mess with lots of bits of code everywhere. So we're just going to clean that up and make it more engine friendly as we kind of develop further. So if you got part 3 done, just drag the game.js, and if you don't have it and you're skipping into this one, that's okay. There's a link in the description for the for the GitHub, so you can download the files and start right away. So we're going to open up our game.js, and this is where we left off before. So this is where we render our sprites here. We change some of the properties of the sprites, then we render them onto a back buffer, and then we render some stuff onto a light buffer, and then we render them both onto the screen using different blend methods here and here. So this time we want to start changing stuff around so that way it becomes more formalized. And so to start, where we have our sprites like this here, where sprite 1, sprite 2, halo and white, we have them just as here as individual variables, but instead we're going to put them into a object. So we're going to call the object sprites, and we're just going to mess around with. So the first one's called man on fire, second one's called walker, next one's called halo, and last one's called white. Okay, we'll tab that in and we replace these equals with colons because it's now an object, and we replace these semicolons with commas. If you're a real purist and you hate the dangling comma like this, well, deal with it. I think it's a lot easier to start adding stuff to a list later if you leave a comment at the end. So if I want to add something to the end of it, I can just hit duplicate and then just change the properties of this, and that way I don't have to worry about messing around with commas or anything like that. This is a little convenient way of doing it. So this should break our code, and let's open up our debug console, because yeah, we're now making references to sprites down here that no longer exist. The way we're going to do this is we want to, at the moment we have 2 layers that we're using, but we want to kind of work with an arbitrary set of layers. And the best way to think about that is that you can do that with 2 buffers. So you have one buffer which represents your final image, and then you have a second buffer which represents the active layer. So we render stuff to the active layer, and then when we're done with that layer, we render that onto our final layer, and then once the final layer is completed, we render that onto the screen. So to do that, we're going to have 2 buffers. So we're going to have one here called final buffer, and it's going to be a type of back buffer. It's going to have the same properties. It's just going to change the name. Right, so our rendering really starts after these. So I'm just going to move these down below our, because this here is just done for test purposes, these sprite changes. So I'm going to put those at the top of the functions, kind of out of the way. And then all our actual rendering stuff is going to be down here. So first thing we're going to get rid of, and this is from the last one, is get rid of this clear in our set buffer method. And the reason why we're going to get rid of that is because we're going to be setting the buffer quite a lot, and we don't necessarily want to clear it every time we set it. So make sure, this is absolutely vital if you're following on at home, is to delete this line here, because we will clear the buffer manually ourselves. So there we go, let's delete it. Right. So before we get anything done, we're going to create a new function here called function, oh well, not function, call it gather, let's see, call it gather renderables. And what this is going to do is go this dot renderables is a new class variable equals a new singleton, and we're going to declare some arrays, first array of layers, and then within those layers an array of objects we want to render to those. So we can start by first of all creating layers as a as a property within our object, and then within layers it's an array. So our first one, we start with a new object here, and this is going to be this is going to be our layer, and so we're going to give it a blend mode of 0, which would be our default blend mode, but that'll come up later. And we're going to give it some objects, so objs, and objs is going to be another array. And within this, so our objects is going to be a list of commands that we want our renderer to follow. So in it, first and foremost, we're going to have our sprite, and it's going to refer up to here to one of our sprites that we declared in our object at the start. So it's going to make a reference to that. So we want to render man on fire. Okay, then we set a position, and it's going to be an x of I don't know, 32, and a y of 32 as well. Okay, and then we want to set the frame, same deal, but this time it's going to do 0, 0, or sorry, x 0 and a y of 0. Then we're going to add a few other properties here. We're going to add flip, and I'm going to set false. We have no code at the moment to flip a sprite, but you know that might be useful later. And lastly, we're going to put in some options. Oh, and then we're going to add in its own blend mode, so we can set a blend mode for each individual sprite. The default for that's going to be 0. Just keep it 0 like that. And then finally, we're going to have some options. And then they're going to be an empty object like this here. And we'll do that twice. So one for our man on fire, and the second one for the walker. And we'll set the position a wee bit further over to the left, over to the right, and set it down a little lower as well. So it's 64, 64. Okay, so this is what these are going to be instructions for our renderer to use. And normally this gather renderables will be something you run every frame, but for the moment we're just going to have it run once at the start, and then we're just going to render the same things every frame, just because we don't have any of the other code to determine what sprites should render. So we're just going to hard code some data in there for the moment. So assuming there's no syntax errors, for the moment, just the same runtime error. So okay, let's get down here. So now that we have our layers, we're going to have to create a for loop that goes through each layer. So for let L equals 0. So while L is less than this dot renderables dot layers dot length L++. So it's going to run through our layers, and then we're just going to let layer, which is going to be our current layer, is this dot renderables dot layer, and we're going to use L. More code experience might be wondering why I'm not using I, because I'm going to use I here instead. So I equals 0. I is less than the layers objs length. It's going to be the length of the object we want to render. We want it then to render those objects. So again, very straightforward. And then we get let obj equals layer objs, and then our current iterated item. All right. So then now the next part is we're going to start flipping our buffers here. So whenever we start rendering, we want to use our back buffer. So to do that, we go set buffer. So I'm just copy and paste this line. So set buffer to this dot back buffer. This. And we then want to clear it. So we do the this line, this dot GL dot clear, and then clears it with whatever the default layer is. And then once it's finished rendering everything, we set the back buffer to use our final buffer. And then this dot back buffer dot render. And so what this is going to do is we first set it to the back buffer, render our objects to that buffer, then we set it to the final buffer and render the back buffer to the final buffer. And we keep doing that again until we get to the end, whenever we set our buffer to nothing, but then render our final buffer. So this dot final buffer dot render. That really should be it. The rest of the stuff I don't think we need anymore, but we might pinch it for references purposes like this here and stuff. So okay, No errors this time. I took away runtime errors, but nothing is rendering. So let's then get a sprite to render. So we have our OBJ, and if we look up here, our OBJ has a few properties. It's got a sprite. In fact, if I go to the JavaScript of this file, this is a little compact. Go down to game. Whoa, it's fighting me. And we stick a breakpoint in our code here. So our layer is our layer here for OBJS. And our OBJ0, yep, you can see there, it's got a blend mode, flip, frame options. Okay, so we just need to plug those in to our, let's just get this running. So here we go, where we did sprite 1 like this. We're going to do let sprite, it's going to be our current sprite, equals this.sprites, which is the thing we declared up here. And then we get this obj.sprite. And that should be our current sprite. Then we need to get that sprite to render. So this is where we do sprite.render. And now we need to put in some parameters here. So it's going to be obj position and obj frame. And there you go. Already we have our two sprites that we declared up there rendering here. Although one thing we need to move is a blend mode. So this here line here, which we commented out, GL enable this.gl blend. So we need to move this. We only need to call this once because we want it to blend. So we call it when we're getting set up here. So GL.blend. Actually, I'll move it under here. There we go. GL enable this.blend. So that's going to get these sprites to. It's trying to embarrass me. Okay, so obviously that didn't blend, but we'll get back to it anyway. Obviously something else is going on here. But for the moment, it's good to know that we're at least able to render two sprites. I think what we're actually missing is going to be a blend mode. Okay, so we're going to create a new function here, and we're going to call it set blend mode. Make blend mode one word to be consistent. And we're going to take in a integer of bm. Okay, and then create a switch. And switch takes bm as a property. And okay, so we're going to create some constants here ourselves. And if you've never created a constant, I'm going to associate it here with our as a variable, a static variable with our class here. So we put in game dot and then a constant. We'll call it blend mode underscore alpha and make that value 0. And we do that with alpha additive. Have I spelled that right? I hope so. And multiply. So again, we said last tutorial, but if you're not been following from it, think of your Photoshop blend modes. So it's the way that two layers kind of blend together. So multiply. Okay, then you just change the value to 1 and 2. Okay, so let's grab these, copy paste into our switch. So case for blend mode alpha, and then a case for blend mode additive, and then a case for blend mode multiply. And then after that we want to break, and another break, and guess what, another break. Okay, so let's copy and paste some of these different blend modes. So this is our basic blend mode here for alpha, so put that under alpha here. Getting a wee bit short in horizontal space here. I never know when to put line breaks. I suppose I could just do line break like this. And okay, and then we need to do one for additive. So this was our additive blend function here. So we're going to paste that in. And then we need one for multiply, which is this last one here. Okay, and no syntax errors. Before we start rendering a layer down like this, we first of all want to set the blend mode. So this dot set blend mode to whatever the layer's blend mode happens to be. In our case, it's 0. So hopefully, yep. There we go. Now it's blending properly. So this is using additive, alpha. So the alpha of these sprites around the edges here are now blending seamlessly with the background cornflower blue. And then whenever we blend the sprites in to our current frame buffer, we also want to use the objects blend mode. So, okay, so far so good. So we do change our blend mode, say to, we want to make it additive for this set of legs here. If I scroll over and change this blend mode, with any luck at all, it should, yes, change the way it blends in here, which is sort of adding its color values onto the background. You can see here where the black doesn't add anything, but the rest of it does. And likewise, if I make this blend mode multiply, you can see here now it's kind of multiplying the values. Excuse me, my voice is going a little. It's adding the color values of the sprite onto the cornflower blue. Sorry, not adding, multiplying. It's multiplying the color values of the sprite to the cornflower blue. And then this one is still using additive. So yep, you can see there that's actually going exactly how we want. So we set this back to alpha. Okay. Alright, so now that we've done that, say we want to render some sprites over it. So we'll just copy and paste it and we'll change the sprites. So this will be white. And this one will be halo. And halo will render down a bit further across the screen again. We'll make it like 128 by 160. Alright, and then, okay, now we can see it's rendering this layer over the previous layer. So it's rendering this new layer over the last one, but it's rendering over. So we're going to have to deal with that. But you can see at least we're rendering that little white square, and we're rendering this big black thing here. So remember earlier we had options as an optional parameter for our blend function. We now want to put those options in here. So obj options like that. That should still render everything fine. Yep. And then that way, if I then copy this into our options for our white, it should hopefully fill the screen. Oh, we really are taking the mickey by drawing across the screen here. So there you go. I'm now drawing. I'm now drawing this dark navy colored square, and you can see if I change the colors that these options are being applied. So I want to draw that for the entire screen like we did with the previous tutorial. So I'm going to set these values to 0, 0, and it's got a width of 512 and a height of 240. And there you go. It fills up the entire screen with a solid magenta square. So if I change the blend mode of this bottom one to additive. Oops, don't lose your comma. There you go. You can see now this. In fact, actually, I'll render it a wee bit higher up the screen. It's a bit low there. So 80, half it. You can see now it's drawing this kind of white halo, and then it slowly blends back into the magenta color again. And that's what we want. But the thing is, now we're using this blend mode here, so we want to change that blend mode to multiply. Okay, that's not ideal. So what's going wrong here? Make sure after you set the default context to set the blend mode here back to alpha, and to put in a clear here, so that way our frame is clear before we start drawing our final buffer onto it. I'm sure the more eagle-eyed of you at home probably spotted this problem and are screaming at the screen, but oops, I slightly missed it. I forgot to close this set of curly brackets and then open up a new set of curly brackets. I'm surprised I didn't throw a syntax error. And there we go. That's it. That's us now rendering two arbitrary layers as declared here by our gather renderables function, which sets up a serializable not JSON, but a serializable object here that is then processed by a render function and then draws the stuff on screen. So now that we have this, we could sort of arbitrarily start adding new stuff to it, like a second and third walker. So I don't know, we'll put that 128, this one right at the top of the screen, and then move this up and then move this one down, and then we render it. There we go, I have a bunch of extra stuff in there. And now you can start seeing, like, maybe this is how we start passing on information to our renderer to render it on screen every frame. That we can send like information packed up in this form that are then our main loop will then process and render. And the thing is as well, the way we've got this set up with the two frames kind of, you know, one flipping onto the other means that we can have any number of frames. So, but the thing is as well, everything on this frame will be rendered over by everything on this frame, so that last frame will always take priority over the previous one. So, you know, the order here matters between these objects. The order between layers is what ultimately matters between objects of two different layers. Alright, well, we're going to wrap it up there. Well, let's delete this first. I'm going to wrap it up there. I think this is a pretty good small step. I'm going to get rid of this test stuff that animated here as well, so we just have a more clean render function. If anything, I think our code probably went down in lines this time round. But now that we have a system set up for rendering an arbitrary number of layers and arbitrary number of sprites, I think maybe next we should start looking into logic and telling what our renderer should render per frame. And that might mean delving a little bit into multi-threading. And I'm sure if you've never dealt with that, it sounds intimidating, but don't worry. It's pretty fine. JavaScript makes it so that nothing can really go wrong. It's just wrapping your head around the concept in the first place is the tough part. Alright, well, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time in the next tutorial. Thanks very much.